Thank you, Lennart. Hello to all of you. I would like to start by thanking the Psychedelic Society of Belgium for the invitation and congratulate them for organizing this first symposium on psychedelics in Belgium, which is already a big success. I come from Paris, and I am sincerely delighted and honored to be here with you this afternoon. My name is Vincent, and I would like to address today, in particular, the people in the audience who know nothing or not much about psychedelics. I would like to convince you this afternoon that hallucinogenic mushrooms, LSD, and related drugs have been banned by mistake, and that they are a fascinating topic of scientific investigation. Psychedelic substances are a real treasure trove that we must learn to know, for it is high time we took a reasoned look at their potential to help or serve humanity. So of course, they are prohibited substances, and if they are, it is because they have been considered as very dangerous substances without medical interest, and which can cause addiction. But we now know that as long as one takes the trouble to prepare oneself psychologically, to prepare the environment in which this drug is taken, if you don't do it recklessly, taking a high dose of hallucinogenic mushroom or LSD is not particularly dangerous. We also know that these substances have a clear medical benefits that my fellows will talk about, and we know that they are not addictive. 20 years ago, I didn't know all of this. 20 years ago, I would never have dared to take LSD or magic mushrooms. The authorities, the school, my parents, all explained to me that drugs were bad. And when I was in high school, in the 1990s, I remember very well chatting in whispers in a Spanish class with my neighbor, who used to go to rave parties, and who told me how scary it was to take acid. Like almost everyone else, I was afraid of LSD and hallucinogenic mushrooms, but not so much of beer. But here in Belgium, beer is sacred, so But one day, I made a sensational discovery. 20 years ago, I was a student in environmental sciences at the National Museum of Natural History in Paris, and as a part of my training, I had to spend some time studying at a remote biology station in Dinard, Brittany. And one day, in this sort of old worm-eaten mansion, I discovered a dusty storeroom where an old writing desk has been sold, and where there was a pile of old papers covered with cobwebs and spiders. Out of curiosity, I took a look at it, and I was amazed to find that all these papers, yellowed by time, were in fact scientific documents from the 1950s about hallucinogenic mushrooms in Mexico. Actually, I had discovered the working papers of Professor Roger Heim, a former director of the Museum of Natural History in France, who was involved in the discovery of divinatory mushrooms of some indigenous people of Mexico. I immediately immersed myself in reading those forgotten documents and was instantly fascinated by the subject. The study of hallucinogenic mushrooms brings together disciplines such as anthropology, psychology, mycology, medicine, archaeology, chemistry, history, religious sciences, cognitive sciences, philosophy, arts, etc. In the last 20 years, Also, the scientific world has begun to take an interest in them again from a medical point of view. But the interest in these substances probably extends beyond the medical field. I propose to take you on a journey of discovery of what the Aztecs called Teonanacat, that is to say, the wondrous or divine mushroom. I hope to convince you that we could certainly benefit from an ambitious research program to investigate the full potential of hallucinogenic mushrooms and, more generally, of psychedelics, because they are probably powerful tools not only to heal us, but also, perhaps, to help us build a better world simply because they are tools for intellectual, philosophical, and even spiritual exploration. But when and how the Western world discovered the subject? To answer this question, we have to go back to the 16th century. When the Spanish conquistadors invaded the Aztec Empire, they witnessed the use of intoxicating and sacred mushrooms. At the coronation of the ruler Moctezuma II, King Moctezuma, in 1502, for example, it is known from the writings of a Spanish missionary that inebriating mushrooms were consumed to induce visions and revelations about the future. Other texts from the 16th century tell us about the use of intoxicating mushrooms in Mexico at that time. They tell us that for the Aztecs, these mushrooms were imbued with sanctity, and that while their consumption accompanied religious life, they could also be consumed freely. Freely until the Spanish invaders prohibited their use in 1620. Divination with hallucinogenic plants and mushrooms were banned by the Catholic Spaniards in the early 17th century, and so no more was heard until the 20th century. The wondrous or divine mushroom seemed to fall into oblivion. The Native American rituals associated with the sacred mushrooms seem to have disappeared forever, but they continued to exist very quietly in remote areas. More than 3 centuries later, the existence of these mushrooms was revealed to the world, to the Western world, by the Wassons, a couple living in New York. Gordon and Valentina Wasson became fascinated with mushrooms and decided to found a new science, ethnomycology, the scholarly study of the relationship between people and mushrooms. In this context, they were helped by Professor Roger Haim of the National Museum of Natural History in France. In the course of their research, they rediscovered the use of psychotropic mushrooms among the Mazatec people of Mexico. So, thanks to my work on Professor Roger Haim's archives, I can trace the history of the rediscovery of the divinatory mushrooms of Mexico. And because at the time of their discovery in 1953, they were still used for divination by the Mazatec villagers in discreet nighttime ceremonies. The cult of mushrooms, which continued in secret in the remote mountains of the Mazatec Sierra, was gradually transformed and mixed with Christianity. Professor Roger Haim was able to identify or name the species of mushrooms used, including Psilocybin mexicana. He also managed to cultivate them in a laboratory in Paris. In 1956, Roger Haim then wanted to test them on himself, and he took twice too much. He tried to take some notes, that you can see here. Having read those notes, I saw that he quickly stopped writing. He did, however, reports on his experience to the Academy of Sciences. the ink in his pen changed color. He began to make jokes aloud. The surrounding objects became duplicated. And then he was struck by the exceptional beauty and depth of color of his carpets. Later, the floor curved, forcing him to hold on to the fireplace. Roger Helm also had the opportunity to consume these mushrooms during expedition to Mexico with a healer named Maria Sabina. He also carried out other experiments on himself in Paris, and he reported to the Academy of Sciences that after enjoying the characteristic color visions for several hours, he often returned to an ordinary state of mind with a blissful clarity of mind and exceptional well-being. Obviously, after reading this kind of reports, one may be tempted to try such an experiment on oneself. This is what I did, cautiously, starting with small quantities, then increasing the doses as I tried. And I can also testify to the magnificence of the vision, the color, and also to this feeling of well-being that comes after the experience when you return to normal. Actually, my experiments with hallucinogenic mushrooms carried out alone and with great care rid me of the social anxiety and gloominess that were hampering me, even though my only aim was to satisfy my curiosity. Now, in 1955, when Mrs. Wasson, who was a doctor, a physician, doctor, experimented with sacred mushrooms of the Mazatec during an expedition to Mexico, she understood that the active compound of these mushrooms would become a precious tool for the study of psychological processes and perhaps a medicine. But how does one make a medicine from the divinatory and sacred mushrooms of Mexican indigenous peoples? Thanks to the success of the cultivation tests carried out in Paris on the species collected in Mexico, the active compound of hallucinogenic mushrooms was identified in 1958 thanks to a collaboration with the pharmaceutical company Sandoz in Switzerland. The new molecule, named psilocybin by the chemist Albert Hofmann, the inventor of LSD, Sandoz quickly produced psilocybin, and Roger Helm arranged it to be tested immediately at the Sainte-Anne Hospital in Paris. Sorry. IT guy, there is a... I miss a slide. Okay.
So we will have to imagine it.
Yes, just use your imagination. So we are in Paris in a mental hospital. It's not a good place to imagine yourself. So in this place, Hospital Sainte-Anne, experiments were carried out on healthy volunteers and on mentally ill patients. The doctors noted sensory manifestations, of course, but also the revival of buried memories. These bursts of memory were considered interesting for psychotherapy. There were some spectacular recoveries in a few mental patients, only a few, such as a woman with anorexia who often spoke of her experience to the doctors, declaring it very beneficial. It must be said that she had a mystical, ecstatic experience with religious visions, and angels playing the flute to her. She also relieved scenes from her unhappy childhood, which enabled her to understand the origin of her suffering, which favored her healing, of course. It is also interesting to note that the theme of the spiritual or religious is frequently present in the experiences. One volunteer funny. One volunteer who had participated in several experiments with the mushrooms grown at the Paris Natural History Museum painted a magnificent Christ on the wall of his apartment. Following a spontaneous impulse 1 month later after his sixth and last experiment. He had never drawn in his life for artistic purposes and, by his own admission, was not particularly good at drawing. Roger Hain concluded that he had acquired a talent. 4 years later, this volunteer said that these experiences not only made him better able to cope with life's difficulties, to face his destiny and his problems with detachment, but he said he took an interest in philosopher or mystical authors such as Kierkegaard, Simone Weil, St. John of the Cross, and he felt as one with them. His personality and interest changed after his experiences with the sacred emotions. Clinical experiments with psilocybin in hospitals took place in Paris, France from 1958 onwards. I tell you straight away, despite some spectacular results, these experiments did not work very well. And unlike what happened in North America, research into psychedelics therapies did not last long in France. Experiments with psilocybin in France had to stop around 1963, before the prohibition in 1966. Now, why did these attempts to explore the therapeutic potential of psilocybin fail? I give 3 reasons. First, a cultural problem, a certain mentality common among French doctors at the time that predisposes people to prejudices about hallucinogens. Basically, in the French scholarly world, hallucinogens are commonly perceived negatively and thought of according to the psychotomimetic paradigm. In other words, hallucinogens drive you crazy. For a moment, you experience what a schizophrenic experiences, you have a psychotic break. Therefore, it could hardly be a medicine. Many French psychiatrists still think this way nowadays. Secondly, in the early 50s, chlorpromazine was discovered in France, and neuroleptics were to experience their moments of glory. Neuroleptics are much easier to integrate, much easier to use than psychedelics. No setting thing, no mystical experience to integrate. Thirdly, the doses of psilocybin used in these French trials in the 50s and 60s were certainly too low. Moreover, no attention was given to the preparation, the set and the setting, and as a result, it didn't work well, of course. As I said, once the molecule was identified by Albert Hofmann thanks to mycologist Roger Hain, the latter arranged for the substance to be tested quickly at Sainte-Anne Hospital, and in this hospital, clinical trials were carried out on 92 healthy volunteers and also on 72 mentally ill patients from 58. The healthy volunteers allowed for a more precise symptomatological study. It should be noted that the volunteers were not allowed to treat in peace, if I can put it this way, but were subjected to various examinations such as patellar reflexes, Rorschach tests, and interviews with psychologists, which required them to change rooms and floors. In these reports, I noticed a tendency to slight dysphoria. One of the volunteers said, "I am a little bit annoyed by the prosaicness of the examiner and his worries as a judge who wants to write everything down and stops my momentum." End of quote. Poor volunteers. they must have had a hard time being bothered by physicians while they were on psilocybin. The analysis that was given of these experiences is totally in line with the psychotomimetic paradigm, since the authors were using the lexical field of pathology and spoke of the psychopathological study of an experimental psychosis. However, we now know that the psychedelic experience is not an experimental psychosis, and some indigenous people of Mexico knew this too, since for them these are sacred mushrooms which allow divination and the visitation of another divine world. Now a word about doses. Most of the trials on healthy volunteers were done with 9 or 10 milligrams of psilocybin. 15 milligrams was considered as an upper limit not to be exceeded. With such low doses, we see an underestimation if we compare it to modern experiments. With regards to trials on the mentally ill patients, similarly, most of the 80 patients received low doses of 9 or 10 milligrams. These hospitalized patients presented a wide variety of mental illnesses: schizophrenics, chronic delusional disorders, manic depressive psychosis, mentally retarded persons, neurosis, and the conclusion of a medical dissertation that I would have liked to present here on the slide, but never mind. A medical dissertation presented in 1960 concluded that the interest of psilocybin on mentally ill patients consists in the exacerbation of psychiatric syndromes for diagnostic purposes. But the psychiatrists also understood that the reminiscence of buried memories allowed a significant number of patients to understand the origins of their disorder. However, after administration of psilocybin to these mentally ill patients, the authors did not note any improvement of symptoms, except sometimes during the time of the experiments, or then only for a very, very period of time, only 1 or 2 days. In conclusion, to retrace the history of French psychedelic psychiatry is to tell the story of a failure, of a missed opportunity. For fear of giving doses that were too high, considered too high, French psychiatrists missed the opportunity to discover a very interesting therapeutic tool, as the other speakers will explain in a moment. French doctors were also prisoners of a cultural prejudice that psychotropic drugs are dangerous a priori. Now this is the slide I wanted to show you. This is why, with some friends from the French Psychedelic Society, we are working to change the way we look at psychedelic molecules in France. And I'm pleased to say that it is starting to work. There will soon be clinical trials with psilocybin and LSD with public funding in France and in public hospitals. And also, in the framework of my academic research in applied philosophy, I am trying to demonstrate that psychedelics invite us to go beyond the usual categories of the normal and of the pathological, and to consider the category of the extraordinary, of the wondrous. Psychedelics do not take you from a normal state to a state of psychosis, which would be very risky. Psychedelics take you from a normal state to an extraordinary state, from which you return transformed. Transformed how? That depends, and it's up to scientific research to enlighten us on this point. I'm going to finish by asking you a question. If it is not dangerous, if it is not addictive, if it can heal, and if it is interesting, do you see any moral objection to having an extraordinary experience? Thank you for your attention.